Hello again, you're with RT. Now, Amnesty International says the American military is underplaying the number of civilians killed by US airstrikes in Syria and Iraq.
We do, as you point out, feel that it's still pretty insignificant given the amount of killings which they've likely caused. So Syrian human rights organisations have documented at least 650 civilian deaths. We've looked in detail at 11 cases in which we believe 300 civilians were killed, and that's in Syria alone. So with them having now announced that something like 119 civilians have been killed across the two countries, that may be just, say, perhaps 10% or 5% of the true civilian death toll from US-led coalition attacks in the countries. They did not find them to have breached international humanitarian law, and that they had taken all feasible precautions to ensure that civilians were protected, but they have not made public on what grounds they found that. So we would urge them to make that information public, because we cannot second that at the moment, and we still have a lot of concerns that many of their attacks in both countries have likely violated international humanitarian law.
Meanwhile, Western-backed Syrian opposition forces have criticised the US-led coalition too, that after at least 23 civilians, including 7 children, were reportedly killed in airstrikes near the city of Raqqa in Syria on Tuesday. They warned that such attacks are becoming more frequent. Coalition jets are providing air cover for the Syrian armed groups mounting an offensive to retake the city, which is Islamic State's de facto capital. Well, RT's Genichikian went to the State Department to ask about the seeming discrepancy in the numbers of civilian deaths attributed to US airstrikes.
The Pentagon assessment is that over the past 2 years, U.S. strikes in Syria and Iraq have killed 119 civilians. Amnesty International estimated coalition strikes in Syria alone have killed 300 civilians. I asked the State Department why the discrepancy, and the spokesman referred me to the Pentagon, but some of what he said did contradict what Amnesty International told us.
Amnesty International estimated at least 300 civilians killed in coalition strikes in Syria alone, while the number that the Pentagon acknowledged is much lower. Why do you think the discrepancy?
I don't know. I would refer you to the Department of Defense. What I can say is we have actually brought, I think our DoD colleagues have brought in some of these, I'm not sure if it's Amnesty International specifically, but some of these other NGOs who have reported some of these higher numbers to try to square the circle, if you will, to try to talk about where these discrepancies might have come into play.
We're a little bit disappointed that some 6 weeks after we submitted our memorandum, 27 pages of it, to the US authorities, we still have had no direct response for them. None of the actual 11 incidents we included were in those 24 incidents you mentioned, which are in the latest information from the Pentagon.
The State Department says that the U.S. does everything to minimize civilian casualties. Amnesty International says not enough.
We make every effort to protect civilians during our operations. That includes the use of precision munitions or weapons. And as we've said before, it also includes making a decision at times to not strike valid targets if we feel that it puts undue risk on civilians.
Often, if a IS target was hit or perhaps missed, perhaps more could have been done to ensure that civilians had left the area beforehand, that greater checks could have been done to make sure that civilians were not actually there. So we think that probably the US authorities are failing to adequately assess the intelligence which they're provided, and they're not doing enough to acknowledge civilian deaths when they've taken place.
The U.S. government says it investigates all credible reports of civilian casualties to learn from mistakes. The human rights group is not so sure.
When we looked at what happened in Manbij in Syria, when probably in the region of 250 civilians were killed for a place with some tens of thousands of civilians, you compare that with Mosul and around 1 million or more civilians. There's a significant risk, particularly if these lessons are not being learnt, that many more civilians will be killed.
Pentagon investigations into civilian casualties usually lead to the conclusion that it was unintentional and therefore not a crime. Through these 2 years of U.S. operations both in Syria and Iraq, there has been no case in relation to the killing of civilians that was ruled a crime.
That was again Shikian. Well, former Pentagon official Michael Malouf told RT that collateral damage by the US does play into the hands of Islamic State.
The humanitarian NGOs are definitely on the ground. They can go in there and see firsthand in many respects. And the United States, and it's in U.S. interest and Western coalition interest to minimize the number of casualties. The problem with the high number is the fact that this is only ingratiating more converts to Daesh as a result of the killing of innocent civilians. And I think that, again, that the rules of engagement are allowing for a certain number of casualties of civilians if they're going after these high-value targets, and the United States wants to minimize that. I don't know how the United States investigates whether a report was credible or not, because we don't have people on the ground.